Children see things adults don't. This is something we accept without question. Psychologists label it as imagination, the mind's way of making sense of isolation, fear, or the strange vastness of the adult world. When a child talks to an empty corner, we smile gently. When they draw the same figure again and again, we hang it on the fridge and call it a phase. And when they name something that no one else can see, we write it off as harmless fantasy. But what if it isn't? What if the figure they describe, the voice they answer, the game they insist must be played in the dark, isn't make-believe but memory? What if they didn't invent the name? What if they remembered it? In thousands of cases across time and culture, children have described eerily similar presences. A tall shadow, a watcher, a shape that doesn't move unless you stop looking. Sometimes it wears a hat, sometimes it crawls, sometimes it stands just behind the closet door, but it always arrives before language, before fear, before the child even knows how to describe what they're seeing. And so they name it, the way children do, softly, instinctively, the same way they name their toys or their drawings or the stories they haven't told anyone yet. And then they grow up. The shadow fades. The name is forgotten. Until one day, by accident or design, it returns. It might be years later, in a book pulled from a forgotten shelf, in an old manuscript, in the margins of a folklore journal. A symbol, a figure, and beneath it, a name. The name, the one you thought you made up, the one you whispered at 4 years old in the dark, trying to make something stay away, or maybe something stay close. Because that's the thing about imaginary friends. We assume they're projections, that the child invents them. But in dozens of ancient traditions, Mesopotamian, Sufi, pre-Columbian, there are warnings. Stories of beings that wait in the threshold between waking and dream, drawn not by ritual, but by recognition, by the act of being named. They don't come to hurt. Not at first. They come to be seen. And they find the youngest eyes, the ones still blurry with memory from before this world, the ones that haven't yet learned to forget. So if you had a name as a child, a shadow only you could see, a figure you can't quite recall but still dream about, ask yourself this: did you name it, or did it tell you what it was and trust you wouldn't remember? Welcome to the Forbidden Library. You've already met once before. If you lay out children's drawings from across the world, from different continents, languages, and time periods, a strange pattern begins to emerge. Amidst the usual scribbles, stick figures, and bright shapes, there are anomalies. Figures drawn in black, always alone, sometimes with glowing eyes, sometimes with no face at all, often standing beside the child's own figure, silent, towering, or crouched just behind the lines of color, half invisible, yet always present. Psychologists usually explain this as subconscious projection. Children externalize their fears, they say. They create monsters to process anxiety, stress, or trauma. But that explanation begins to unravel when you compare drawings from places that never interacted, from villages in northern Finland to rural India to the Amazon basin to children in modern urban cities. The shadow shows up again and again, not always the same shape, but close enough, slender, watching, never smiling, and almost always named. That's the part that gets ignored in most developmental studies, the names. These figures aren't just drawn, they're spoken to, trusted, feared, given titles. And when researchers began collecting those names, in different regions among children with no cultural overlap, certain phonetic patterns repeated. Words with hard consonants, back-of-the-throat syllables, unnatural vowel combinations for their native tongue, names like Gora, Tsalem, Nefari, Raven, names the children couldn't explain, but insisted were just what it told me. Some of these names appear in historical folklore, in cultures where they were considered spirits, tricksters, or omens. In 17th century Polish church records, a priest recorded over a dozen confessions from young children who claimed to be speaking with someone named Kalash. When cross-referenced with Mongolian cave art, that same name appears phonetically etched into stone near a drawing of a tall, hornless figure with 3 arms. The site dates back over 2,000 years. In West Africa, Dogon oral traditions include stories of the Pale Listener, a being that waits at the edge of dreams, visible only to children and animals. Drawings made by children during colonial studies in the early 1900s show nearly identical features to contemporary sketches made in American schools: large head, long fingers, and no discernible mouth. Even more disturbing are the behavioral patterns. Children who name these shadows often exhibit sudden bursts of vocabulary beyond their years. Some begin using symbols or pictograms without being taught. Others display inexplicable knowledge of events, languages, or mythologies they've had no exposure to. A 9-year-old girl in southern Italy was recorded naming her shadow Avar. When her parents looked it up, they found it matched the name of a pre-Christian boundary spirit, a figure worshipped in secrecy to protect homes from what walked between. And still, no one takes it seriously. The drawings are boxed up, the names are forgotten, the shadows fade, but not for everyone. Because for a small number of children, the figure never goes away. They stop talking about it, but they still draw it. Or they stop drawing it and start dreaming of it instead. And when they become adults, they almost never remember the name. Almost. Memory, as we understand it, is unreliable, fluid, fallible, shaped as much by suggestion as by fact. But there are some memories that don't feel learned. They feel embedded. A song you've never heard but know how to hum. A word you don't recall learning but speak fluently in dreams. A name you haven't said since childhood, until one day it rises on your tongue like it never left. In early mystical thought, especially among the Sumerians and later the Egyptians, the name was more than identity. It was function. To know the name of a thing was to hold power over it, and to be known by something was to be bound to it. But certain traditions, especially those preserved in hidden temple texts and esoteric dream scrolls, spoke of names that didn't belong to any living being. They belonged to forces, things that entered a child's perception only because children hadn't yet forgotten the veil that aging pulls tight. In one fragment of the Sifra de Zenuta, a mystical Kabbalistic text, there's mention of Shemot Hanistarim, the names that remember themselves. These weren't meant to be invoked. They were echoes from a time before forgetting. Some mystics believed young children were still open to those names, that in early life, the soul is closer to its original form and may remember things not meant for this lifetime. A boy in rural Argentina once drew a tall black figure with long limbs and a twisting neck labeled Onael. Years later, an occult researcher found the same name etched into a 16th century French grimoire, listed as the servant of broken sight, who stands beside children and waits to be renamed. Modern neuroscience would argue that childhood is a time of misfiring synapses, overactive imagination, archetypal shadow work. But that doesn't explain the patterns. In case after case, the names children whisper match phonemes, glyphs, or concepts found in ancient texts they have no access to. What makes these encounters even stranger is how the memory of the name behaves. It's not stored like other memories. Many adults don't recall their imaginary friends, but when they hear the name again, from a symbol, a glyph, a line in an ancient book, they don't just remember the sound. They remember the feeling that came with it, the rules, the rituals, the sensation of not being alone. Some even recall conversations, full sentences spoken to the shadow in their room, advice whispered in the night, answers to questions they hadn't yet learned to ask. These aren't simple recollections. They're embedded narratives, as though the name unlocked a stored archive not in the brain, but somewhere deeper. Some theorists in fringe psychology have proposed the concept of mnemonic parasitism, the idea that certain names carry an emotional or symbolic frequency so specific they attach themselves to developing minds like signatures waiting for recognition. Not ideas planted externally, but identities waiting to reawaken. And if that's true, then what children encounter isn't fiction. It's memory, but not theirs. The figure doesn't visit them randomly. It's found them before, in another cycle, another name. And when they speak it aloud, even in play, it's not just a title, it's an invitation. It always starts the same way, something small. A book left open in an unfamiliar section of a library. A late-night dive into a forgotten thread on a folklore forum. An image on a page that stops your breath cold, not because it's frightening, but because it's familiar. A figure drawn in a style centuries old, but it looks like something you sketched as a child. And beneath it, in rough, faded lettering, is a name. The name, the one you haven't spoken in decades, the one you thought you made up. It's the moment everything rearranges. You tell yourself it's coincidence, a trick of memory. Maybe you heard it somewhere and forgot. Maybe you've confused a dream with something real. But the feeling doesn't pass. The moment lingers. Because when you see that name, written in an old book, a language you don't read, beside a figure you thought was imaginary, it doesn't feel like discovery. It feels like recognition. This moment, once rare, is becoming more common. Online message boards are filled with stories that sound almost identical. People describing childhood friends they haven't thought about in years. Tall shadows, smiling things, crawling shapes, all drawn in childhood notebooks, all accompanied by strange names. And years later, they're found again, in antique books, museum archives, even sacred texts. One man described finding his childhood drawing in a centuries-old grimorium he stumbled across while researching old monastic codes. The creature was the same, down to the scar across its face. Its name was written in Latin characters beneath the image. The same name he had used at 5 years old, Silreth. A woman in Romania posted anonymously about a story from her childhood, a game she used to play with a shadow in her room called Ether. She described it in detail. It stood at the corner of the ceiling, only appeared when the room was cold, and never spoke unless she covered her ears. Years later, she visited a small museum in Sicily. Inside was a glass case holding an old textile from the 1400s, embroidered with a tall, black figure, its limbs impossibly long. She didn't need the guide's translation of the name stitched at the bottom. She already knew it. Some go further. After rediscovering the name, they begin to dream of the figure again. Or worse, they never stopped. One man admitted he never told his partner about the friend he had as a child. But after seeing the name in an article about ancient shadow spirits, his partner confessed they had been having recurring dreams of a tall shape standing at the door. When he asked what they called it in the dream, she whispered the name. It was the same. These aren't isolated cases. They are fragments of a larger pattern, one where the imagined becomes historical, where childhood fiction is found in sealed archives, on buried walls, in languages long dead, and all of them speak to one horrifying truth. You didn't invent it. You just remembered it first. We tell ourselves it was just a phase, that we outgrew it, that we misremembered, that whatever we saw in the corners of our childhood bedroom, whatever name we whispered into the dark, it was just a trick of the brain, a coping mechanism, a growing mind projecting its fears. But if that were true, then why does it still feel close? Why, after all these years, can you still picture its shape, clearer than most people from your past? Why does the name still sit somewhere deep in your chest, beneath language, ready to be spoken if something ever asked again. Because if it was imaginary, it should have faded, but instead, it waited. Ancient traditions warned us. They taught that names are not just identifiers, they are bindings. When you name something, you give it form, access. You make room for it inside your reality. And when a child speaks a name for the first time, something answers. It doesn't matter that we forget, it remembers. And in remembering, it lingers. Not to harm, not even to haunt, but to be known again. What we call imaginary friends may not be imaginary at all. They may be ancient presences, old watchers, thought forms, spirits, or something older than any of those words. Something that waits for a vessel of recognition. Something that needs a name spoken aloud so it can step back through. And who better than a child to speak it? They say children are more open, more intuitive. But what if that's not because they're sensitive, but because they haven't finished forgetting? What if we're born remembering more than we should, and what we call growing up is really the process of sealing those doors shut? But some doors don't seal completely. Some names don't fade. And when they surface again, in a line of ancient script, a forgotten book, a stranger's dream, they don't feel like fiction. They feel like something finally coming back to finish what it started. So, if you ever had a name you whispered in childhood, a name no one else used, a figure no one else saw, ask yourself, do you really believe you made it up? Or did it let you forget? So it could return exactly when you were old enough to understand what it always was.